Namaskar. So tonight's discourse is about something called Paincamakara, or the 5 Ns, a set of practices taught by Shiva to enable people who have difficulty controlling their physical desires to have more control. Tantra can be roughly divided into 2 branches. One crude, in other words, external, material, or physical practices, and the other subtle, meaning internal, psychic, and spiritual practices. The subtle aspect of Tantra is also called the path of yoga. Sadashiva was the creator and teacher of both branches of Tantra, so there cannot be any contradiction between them. Under ordinary circumstances, the human mind is dominated by animal tendencies. Of course, these animal tendencies are not equally strong for all people. Those who have intense physical desires rush towards objects of physical enjoyment. Such people cannot just suddenly give up their objects of enjoyment in favor of spiritual practice. Those whose desire for physical enjoyment is less intense can easily give up physical objects. But what are the first group of people to do? If such people try forcibly to turn their minds away from their objects of enjoyment, they will face disastrous consequences. Psychologists are well aware of the dangers of attempting to suppress or repress one's desires. One may be able to maintain saintliness for a certain time, but the raging storm cannot be contained forever. The practice of the 5 M's, or Paincamakara, was developed for those people who were unable to let go of desires for crude physical enjoyment. The main idea behind the practice of the crude 5 M's is to carry out spiritual practice while in the midst of crude enjoyments. By limiting the use of objects of enjoyment, they will gradually increase their psychic power and will ultimately rise above the attraction of physical enjoyment. For example, a wine addict will drink a controlled measure of wine as a part of his or her spiritual practice. A fish eater will follow certain restrictions. He or she will limit the quantity of fish eaten and will not eat female fish in their spawning period, means when they are laying eggs. In this way, people can gradually establish the superiority of their minds over objects of enjoyment. The practice of the extroversial 5 M's, which are performed externally, will gradually take them to the introversial path, which is performed internally. So, the discourse goes on to describe in detail the introversial, the spiritual path also, but as it was described, that the introversial path is basically the path of yoga. So that's not the topic of tonight's discussion. So I think most people agree that self-control is a good thing. It helps us to be more free. We can do what we want and we can not be controlled by our desires. We may have desires, but we are in control of them rather than they are controlling us. So we are free. We are not controlled by our desires. But I think people also agree that self-repression is not a good thing. It can lead to mental disease. It can lead to what is being repressed bursting out in a harmful way at some point. So I think this discourse is interesting because it kind of talks about the importance of having control, balancing control on the one hand, but not to the extent that it becomes repressive. So the main paragraph is this one. The main idea behind the practice of the crude 5 M's is to carry out spiritual practice while in the midst of crude enjoyments. While carrying out this practice, they will limit the degree of their indulgence. By limiting the use of objects of enjoyment, they will gradually increase their psychic power and will ultimately rise above the attraction of physical enjoyment. So the first part is, it doesn't explain in detail what this is about, but it says to carry out spiritual practice while in the midst of enjoyment. So some kind of ritual was there in the 5M practices, some kind of spiritual practice while the participant in the ritual was eating a limited portion of meat or fish or any of the other items, right? So while carrying out this practice, the ritual, whatever it was, they will limit the degree of their indulgence. So there is some control, there's not only a ritual, but there is some control of limiting the amount. So it's only, say, a small portion of meat or fish. And the idea is that by implementing such limitations, then the objects of enjoyment, the ability to control the objects of enjoyment will gradually increase, the psychic power will increase, and ultimately they will be able to let go of that physical enjoyment. And the idea is that then they can, in a natural way, go into the higher level of the 5 M's, which is basically yogic practices. So in Ananda Marga, we don't have any rituals for eating fish, drinking wine, etc. But I think many, if not most of us, are unable to say that we can give up all animal desires completely. So, what to do? Can we adapt the spirit of the 5 M's in a way that is useful? So here's my suggestions about that, most of which I think you are familiar with. First, give up what you can give up. Meat, fish, onion, and garlic, for example. And don't use the idea of the 5 M's, the Paincamakara, as an excuse to indulge in animal desires, which, unfortunately, some people do and have done in the past, and that has been what has given Tantra a misunderstanding and a bad name. Second, as described in the discourse, set limits on whatever you feel you need more control of. For example, limit watching movies to once a week. Limit sex to twice a month. Whatever seems for you a good balance between being doable and challenging. In other words, something that will push your boundaries but still feel achievable. Go as far as you can, but not so far that it becomes a form of repression. So our master Sri Ananda Murti said, the more self-control you have, the better, but just, it's up to each one of us to decide where the boundary line is between self-control and repression. There's a nice story where there was one Dada who, did long meditation. He was very disciplined and very elevated, but he had one weakness, and that was ice cream. He really was attached to ice cream, and he ate a lot of it. And one day he came to see our master, and he was in our master's room when somebody brought his evening meal. And there was some ice cream there, but only a very small amount. And our master said to him, Dada so-and-so, I can't remember his name, I like ice cream very much, and that is why I take only this much, right? So it wasn't giving up ice cream altogether, but I have a strong desire for it, so I control myself and I take, so that setting the limits develops the mental strength and eventually detachment from that. And after receiving this lesson, this Dada actually was able to let go of his desire for ice cream. Third, and perhaps the hardest part, while enjoying your physical experience, don't forget your mantra. Remind yourself that absolutely everything is God. Then the enjoyment has a spiritual element in it. And gradually the mind will discover that the spiritual part is actually more blissful than the physical enjoyment, and will gradually let go of the attachment more easily. If you make this effort, the mind will naturally become stronger and more spiritual, and your attraction to physical enjoyment will naturally decrease. So if we remember our second lesson mantra, if we remind ourselves that absolutely everything is God, we get a certain kind of happiness, a certain kind of blissful feeling from that. And as that increases, you begin to understand, you begin to feel that this state of mindfulness is actually the real thing that you really enjoy, and that the enjoyment of the ice cream or whatever animal or physical thing that you are enjoying is secondary, but it's maintaining that mindful state, which is the most blissful and important thing for you. So I hope you will find that interesting and useful. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great week. Namaskar.